Hi, I'm Nicholas von Kaufmann, and this is my place in Canadian history. I'm a second-generation Canadian. My father grew up in Unionville, and my mother is originally from Michigan. My father is first-generation Canadian, and both of his parents were born in different countries. My grandfather is German and immigrated to Canada in 1956, and my grandmother from Britain in 1960. The period in which they immigrated from Europe shortly after the war brought many Europeans to Canada and my grandparents too. German and British people have been immigrating to Canada for centuries. Throughout these years, there has been different patterns on when and why Europeans moved to Canada. Although there are many reasons to immigrate to a new country, one seems to be fairly obvious. War. War is something that can have extremely damaging effects on countries for decades after the war. For my grandfather, growing up in Germany was difficult because of many reasons. The economy was in shambles and there wasn't much work. So, in 1956, he moved to Canada in hopes to find work and start a new life. The transition was very hard for him. He had to learn a new language and practically start from scratch. Fortunately for him, he was able to find a job and went to school to become an accountant. But why would he want to go to Canada of all places? He and many other people in Germany were hearing about all the different opportunities in the Western world. Also, he believed that him moving to Canada would be the first step into getting into the US. His story really helps demonstrate the consequences of war and a country's future after war. My grandmother lived very close to London when she was young and was around when the Blitz was going on. After the war, Great Britain was still rebuilding several years after the war ended. She and her friends wanted to travel the world while they were still young, so they went to a couple different countries. When she went to Canada, she stayed in Toronto, and that is where she met my grandfather. She ended up sticking around, and they ended up getting married and starting a family in Unionville. They enjoyed playing hockey, going camping, sailing, and many other things. On the other side, my mother was born and raised just outside of Detroit, Michigan, in Shelby Charter Township. She was the second youngest of 4 children. She grew up in a middle-class family, learning and having fun. In her mid-20s, she and her friends went to the Pinery Provincial Park, and that's where she met my dad. They were able to start a relationship and eventually got married and settled down in St. Catharines, Ontario. Was there really any push factors for my mother? Not really. My mom's only real reason for leaving the States was for my dad and to start a family. Then, when I was born, my parents, my 2 older brothers, and me moved to Stouffville. We lived there for about a year before we moved to Edmonton for my dad's work. We lived there for 3 years until my mom couldn't take the cold anymore and my dad got a job back in Toronto, so we moved back to Stouffville up the street from where my house was. And a couple years later, now we're here.